Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving into something absolutely fascinating and honestly highly debated. We're unpacking Karl Marx's monumental work, Capital. Now, whether you're totally new to this or already know your way around economic theory, our goal today is to map out the sheer structural and mathematical mechanics of capitalism exactly as Marx laid them out. We're not looking at this through a moral lens, okay? Instead, we're going to look closely at the internal logic, the formulas, and the underlying economic law of motion that Marx argued literally drives modern society. Section 1. Commodities, labor, and value, the building blocks of wealth.
You know, Marx doesn't kick off his massive 3-volume critique with these grand, sweeping theories of the state or society. Actually, he starts by looking at a simple, everyday object. Think of a coat, or maybe a piece of linen. He calls this a commodity. Under capitalism, wealth basically presents itself as an immense accumulation of these commodities. But as we'll see, these seemingly simple, everyday objects actually possess a very specific, dual nature. And this brilliantly illustrates that dual nature. On one hand, we have use value. That's just the physical utility of a thing, right? A coat keeps you warm, bread feeds you. But on the other hand, we have exchange value, which is the quantitative proportion at which one thing trades for another. So if one coat equals 20 yards of linen, Marx asks an absolutely crucial question. How on earth can you mathematically equate two completely different physical things? Well, he reasons they must share some hidden common substance. And that substance, Marx concludes, is human labor. They're both products of human effort, measured in time.
Section 2. The secret of surplus value, unlocking the factory doors. Now, what's really interesting here is how the fundamental mathematical circuit of capital is broken down. You see, you don't just have money sitting around. Capital is literally money in motion. It starts with money, M, which is used to buy commodities, C, only to sell them for more money at the very end. We call that M prime. The entire rational motive of this circuit is ending up with more money than you started with. That increment, that extra chunk of money, is what Marx calls surplus value. But where does it actually come from? I mean, you can't just magically create new value by trading things fairly back and forth, right? Well, to solve the math of that MCM prime circuit, the capitalist has to find a very, very special commodity on the market. That commodity is labor power. Notice the distinction there. It's not just labor itself, but the actual capacity to work. So the capitalist buys a worker's labor power for the day. And the unique secret of labor power is that its very consumption, the literal act of working, actually creates new value. And specifically, it creates more value than it costs to keep the worker alive and functioning. Let's visualize exactly how this works on the factory floor with a standard 8-hour workday. In Marx's framework, the day is basically sliced in two. The first block is necessary labor. Let's say that's 4 hours. In those 4 hours, the worker creates enough value to entirely equal their daily wage. But remember, the capitalist bought their labor power for the whole 8-hour day, so the worker keeps working. Those next 4 hours, that's surplus labor. The worker is still creating new value, but they aren't getting paid for it. The capitalist keeps that surplus. This is why, in this specific text, exploitation isn't viewed as a moral failing of some greedy boss. It's a strict, structural, mathematical requirement for capitalism to even function. This brings us to a huge recurring motif in Marx's work: illusion versus reality. On the surface, out there in the market, it all looks like a perfectly fair trade. The worker gets a wage for an 8-hour day. It genuinely looks like all labor is paid. But the structural reality hidden behind those factory doors is that the wage system perfectly masks the fact that a large portion of the day is essentially unpaid surplus labor. Because surplus value comes directly from surplus labor time, there's a built-in mathematical conflict here. The capitalist, exercising their right as the buyer, naturally wants to make the working day as long as humanly possible to extract way more surplus. Meanwhile, the worker, exercising their right as the seller, wants to limit the working day to protect their health and, well, their life. Since both sides are asserting equal rights in the market, Marx famously notes, between equal rights, force decides. And this structural conflict is exactly what leads to the historical struggle over the length of the working day. Eventually, laws actually stepped in and restricted how long the working day could be. So what happens then? How do capitalists increase surplus value if they literally can't lengthen the day? Well, they increase productivity, what Marx calls relative surplus value. Over time, capitalists physically revolutionized human labor to achieve this. They grouped workers together in simple cooperation, then broke tasks down into mind-numbing specialized detail tasks during the manufacturing era, and finally they introduced heavy machinery. The machine doesn't just help the worker. In the factory system, the worker kind of becomes a living appendage to the machine, all to produce goods faster and cheaper, thereby increasing the surplus portion of the day.
Section 3. The circulation of capital, the market and reproduction.
Let's see how this builds. Because for capitalism to survive, that newly created surplus value can't just sit collecting dust in a warehouse. Capital has to undergo what Marx calls its metamorphoses, flowing completely fluidly through 3 distinct phases. It starts as money capital to buy materials, then it transforms into productive capital during the actual manufacturing process, and finally it emerges as commodity capital, which has to be sold on the market to turn back into more money. If capital stalls in any of these phases, say the goods can't be sold or the raw materials can't be bought, the entire economic system faces a massive crisis.
And speed is absolutely everything in this circuit. Notice the difference in turnover time here. On one side, you have fixed capital. This is your massive factory or your heavy machinery. It transfers its value into the final products very slowly, fraction by fraction, over many, many years. On the other side, you have circulating capital, like raw materials and wages, which transfer their value completely in a single production cycle. The faster a capitalist can turn over that circulating capital, the more frequently they can extract and realize surplus value over the course of an entire year.
Section 4. Profit and the big picture, the global system. Now, let's zoom out a bit. To the capitalist, exploitation isn't measured by looking at surplus labor hours. Instead, they look at the rate of profit. They measure the surplus, that's S, against their entire investment, both the machinery, C, and the wages, V. By measuring returns against the total investment, the math actively obscures the true origin of that surplus value. It essentially makes it falsely appear as though the dead machinery creates profit just as much as the living human labor does. This creates a truly fascinating macroeconomic dynamic. Imagine 2 completely different industries. One is highly labor-intensive. Since living labor is the only source of new value in this model, it actually generates a ton of surplus value. The other industry is capital-intensive, mostly automated machines, very little living labor. So technically, it generates a much lower surplus value. But here's the kicker. Capital naturally flows and competes across the entire economy until prices adjust and these different rates equalize. The results? Everyone gets an average rate of profit. This means the total societal surplus value is basically pooled together and shared among all capitalists based on the sheer size of their investment. It's like a giant pool of profit they all draw from.
Marx calls the ultimate illusion of this entire system the Trinity formula. In everyday capitalist economics, it just appears that land naturally produces rent, capital naturally produces profit, and labor naturally produces wages. It just seems like common sense, right? Well, Marx painstakingly deconstructs this. He argues that this concept naturalizes historically specific exploitative relations. It's designed to make the division of wealth look like an eternal, physical law of nature, rather than the result of a very specific social arrangement based on unpaid surplus labor.
Section 5. The origins and crises, history and the future. So looking back, how did the early capitalists get the initial money to buy all these factories in the first place? And why were there suddenly propertyless workers willing to sell their labor? Marx flat out rejects the peaceful myth that early capitalists were just, frugal savers who worked hard. Instead, he outlines something called primitive accumulation. Historically, producers were violently separated from their land and their tools. Through the fencing off of common lands, incredibly violent laws, global colonialism, and the slave trade, a desperate, propertyless workforce was forcibly created to jumpstart the entire industrial capitalist system. And here, we can really see how the monumental scope of Marx's entire 3-volume critique synthesizes perfectly. He starts in Volume 1 with the micro level of the factory and the direct extraction of surplus value. Then he moves in Volume 2 to the continuous flow and circulation of that capital through the wider market. And finally, in Volume 3, he scales all the way up to the total capitalist system, analyzing how that surplus is divided into profit, rent, and interest. He literally mapped the entire DNA of the capitalist mode of production. But according to Marx, that DNA contains a fatal structural contradiction. He identified the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Here's how it works. To beat competitors, capitalists constantly invest in heavy machinery and automation. But remember, Living labor is the only source of surplus value. So by automating, they are actually shrinking their own base of value-producing labor relative to their massive investments. As the profit rate inevitably trends downward, capital gets desperate. It detaches from real physical production and flows into purely speculative, fictitious financial capital, which inevitably drives the economy into severe cyclical crises. So the crucial point here is how Marx actually concludes this whole analysis. Because of the inherent centralization of wealth and these compounding cyclical crises, the system ends up creating forces it can no longer control. Speaking purely neutrally, based entirely on the internal math of his own model, Marx argues that the capitalist shell must eventually burst. He provocatively writes, "The knell of capitalist private property sounds, the expropriators are expropriated." Which leaves us with a massive, lingering question. We've just traced a very structural 19th century analysis of value, labor, and profit. But look around at our modern, hyper-financialized world today, a world of speculative bubbles, AI automation, and gig economy labor. How accurately do Marx's laws of motion map onto the global economy right now? Does this internal math still drive the system today? It's an absolutely fascinating framework to apply to the modern world, and I really encourage you to investigate it further and decide for yourself.
Please like and subscribe.